Thank you all so much for being here. Welcome. I'm really looking forward to today's discussion and from hearing each of yours unique perspectives on what we've been seeing across the industry this past year. I think just even this past quarter alone has revealed so much about the industry, where we're headed, where we currently sit. So I really do think this is a very timely conversation to be discussing what's going on and where we're headed as we get very close to the new year. Jamie, I'd love to start off with you if that's okay. The first question we have for you, and I think this will hopefully set the stage for the conversation, is do you think the vertical farming industry is going through a period of disillusionment? What do you think this means for investment into the sector?
Well, thank you first of all for the invitation for this webinar, and good to see everybody. And welcome from very cold London, where everybody is based today. But I guess most of you are in the US. So I'm an optimist, so I don't really subscribe to this, this ideology that we're going through this period of disillusionment. But I do understand the kind of the source of the question and why people are asking it right now, when you've got big companies that are obviously downsizing and others that are failing. But if I had to think of an analogy, it would be a hot summer, and you have 1 or 2 days of rain, and you're asking everybody else to walk around with umbrellas for the rest of the summer. This is a natural state of affairs that a lot of industries go through. And if we want to set the context, if we look at where we are now, we've just come out of a very deep economic shock through COVID. We've had supply chain shocks as a result of that. We have had astronomical increases in energy prices, which have obviously impacted the sector, cost of living crises, and inflation and interest rate increases, which have obviously impacted all businesses, not just our sector, and obviously the capital markets, so investors as well. But if you look at vertical farming as a sector, and I kind of see us as being in our kind of third wave of the CEA sector more broadly. Any startup, 20% of startups fail within the first year, and about 60%, I think, make it to year 3. So it's normal to see some attrition in these markets. I think the issue that I take, and I think the problem that we have as a community, if you want to call it that, is that we look at success in kind of the wrong way. So we typically, if you look in the press, if you look in the media, you'll typically hear about 5 or 10 companies. In reality, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of CEA companies. And most of those actually will be vertical farming companies globally. But the mentality we have is this kind of, who's got the biggest house on the block, who's raised the most capital. And that's how we look at success. And because of that, I think because of some of these kind of perceived failures or, mass layoffs that have been highly publicized, especially for the publicly listed companies, this question has arisen. But for me, until we start seeing, high numbers of vertical farming companies drop off, and I do think there will be some, because as I said, there will be some natural attrition. I don't think we should be in this period of disillusionment. I think companies that will be in a period of disillusionment are those that have set standards too high, assuming that every company is going to be a multi-billion-dollar vertical farming company, is really the wrong premise to start from. This is a long-term infrastructure play. It's going to be a sector that's going to take many years to develop. There's going to be many failures. There's going to be many successes. And we need to really be looking at improvements at the margin. In terms of how this affects the capital markets, well, it depends on the type of investor you're talking to. So two to 3 years ago, we were talking to VCs and PE funds, and obviously, PE funds will be looking at very quick exits, and they wouldn't talk to us. But now talking more so to infrastructure funds and different types of investors, family offices and so on that have a more altruistic and ESG focused goals. I think really there is still a massive market opportunity and a huge unmet need for not just for vertical farming but for CEA more broadly. I mean, there've been one or two deals I think announced in the last couple of days from I think Goodleaf and Winter Farms, I think both US companies with pretty substantial raises, which is indicative that there is we're still moving in a very positive direction. We just need to recognize that we're going through a very difficult time economically, but it's not a reason to potentially go into an unnecessary level of critique.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point around success, the way we value success and how we perceive that, and how that really filters out even for our new clients who are coming in. Some of them want to be small commercial facilities, and they're not even they don't even have plans to scale up to that size. And I think that there's so many of those, and they add so much value to localizing food, which at the end of the day is what most of us are in the industry trying to do, is make food more secure in local regions and local economies. So I think you're right. It's instead of looking always at the big vertical farms, the publicly traded companies, zoning out a bit and seeing how diverse the industry really is, and where that's going to take us overall, rather than just focusing in on the high level and potentially the disillusionment that those specific companies may be going through because of different projections or inaccurate projections that maybe were set early on. Absolutely. Thanks so much for sharing that. Appreciate it, Jamie. Rob, going off of that, I think cash flow is always an interesting one just for any company in any industry, but in the vertical farming industry and when it comes to high-tech indoor farms, what do you think, in your opinion, why is cash flow such an obstacle for these high-tech indoor farms?
First of all, I love Jamie's answer so much. I too am, I think, an eternal optimist. I think we're all here because we're bullish on vertical farming in general. And if this were 1993, I think we could as easily call this reasons why internet companies are failing, right? I think that's where we are. I think half of the first 25 billion spent in the space has been lost. And that's not an admonishment, it's praise, right? I think we need these pioneers. We need people to try the market. We need people to try stuff. And if they're true entrepreneurs, which I assume they are, they're going to bounce back even stronger. And we can all stand on the shoulders of those giants. In terms of, I'm going to get to your question now. In terms of pitfalls, I think when it comes to cash flow, what I've seen, and I'm a rookie in vertical farming, but not in companies, I guess, is I see two categories. There's complacency and there's over engineering. So what I say in complacency, I think a strong eye on finance in general, like this is startup 101. You want a weekly review of your burn rate, what's your runway, and if you don't have a competent CEO like yelling in your ear from week to week, you have to find one, right? Like, and whether to pull those triggers when you need to, everybody on the team, on the executive team, needs to see that coming. Otherwise, you'd fly directly into a mountain. And in this economic climate, if it's less than 12 months of runway, I think there's decisions to be made. Either with looking at expenditures or looking to raise or looking at a better profitability. I think there are decisions and levers to pull. Second, in under complacency, I would see supply chain. This is an area in which I lived for a decade or so. And it's not a set it and forget it thing, right? You go in, you establish your supply chain and your suppliers, and that should be an ongoing reevaluation. Because a lot of times we don't know what we should be paying. Manufacturers often don't know what they should and shouldn't be paying. And keeping an eye on obsolescence and end of life and what everything around your supply chain. The third thing I would suggest market fluency. I think we're being reminded right now with global events and pandemics and market downturns that we should be listening to what the financial markets are saying. I think we're being reminded of that fact very painfully right now. And we need to reconcile that with your spending, like how much in a better, more bullish market, then yeah, maybe you can extend, you can be a bit more exploratory and a bit more adventurous. The other side is over engineering. I think, like we're so excited about what we can do, we often don't stop and ask ourselves whether or not we should do it. And I think I'm quoting Jurassic Park there, so I apologize. But like, I think this is as true in tech as anyone else. I'm a technologist. I want to build the cool things, and I have built cool things that nobody cared about, for sure. And I think that that's a part of it. So really doing a strong ask, and we're doing it right now, right? Like I'm in product right now, and I literally have asked myself, do we really need to build software? And I'm like, I want to build software, absolutely, but do we really need to, or has someone figured that out for us already? So, and I think that translates to spending, and including time to market, right? So there's an investment in time in getting to there. So, and that translates to path to profitability and revenue.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with you, Robin. I think that what you had mentioned about complacency in particular, and the different elements of that also combined with over technologizing something. I don't even, technologizing, is that a word?
It is now.
Now. But when you over-engineer, pardon me, when you over-engineer something, it also led me to think a little bit about our industry as a whole, and how I think for so long we have been identifying even ourselves in a way as an R&D type industry. So we have been, gaining a lot of funding in that type of regard throughout the years to really build ourselves as this, going from something that is a little bit more, maybe hyped up, or it doesn't have a lot of traction overall, to see, okay, what can we do? What can we really make through R&D? What can we really grow in these different facilities? So I feel like that's also set a precedence maybe for these cash flow challenges, because we have that mindset, and that's what we're appealing to in so many different ways. But at some point it has to change, and we have to now become profitable. We're no longer in a state as an industry where we can just go off of that story anymore. It has to kind of change, the narrative has to change at some point towards profitability. And I think that now comes into play. Everything you just said is now what we need to focus on.
Yeah, I mean, fundamentals in business, we have to keep those always, and then have fun on the other side. Also, like your point about mindset, it just speaks to me. Like, it's nature, right? We cannot control nature, but we can influence it. And I think taking that approach, more working with it than trying to control it, might help with the over-engineering.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Rob.
Mm-hmm.
Jamie, David, did you have anything to add to Rob's points or to this question on obstacles to cash flow for high-tech vertical farms before we move into the next question?
I would like to comment on Rob's point of over-engineering. It's as a indoor shipping container farm manufacturer, I think back to the farms we built in 2016 and 2017 that are not all that elegant. But when I compare them to the farms that we've built in 2022, the yields are about the same. So it's how much engineering do you add in to get a better yield, and what are your goals as a company when you do that? So I thought that was a spot on comment. Thanks, Rob.
Yeah, I also wanted to comment a bit on the over-engineering piece. I mean, as a company, we were growers initially, and then obviously moved on to developing our own technologies. We've been doing that for about 4 years. And I guess if you looked at our systems, you could accuse us of over-engineering. But I think there's a key difference between re-engineering something to make it better as opposed to over-engineering. For us, it's about identifying the bottlenecks in systems and effectively eliminating them. And it's only through kind of research and development, and obviously investment and time and skill and people, that you can do that. But what I would say, I would agree with the fellow panelists, is for things like container solutions and smaller facilities, a highly engineered or over-engineered solution versus a kind of more standardized kind of Dutch solution, they're going to do very much similar, the same job, unless you're doing very detailed R&D where you need different, wavelengths and so on. So I think when it comes to having highly advanced vertical farms, they only really work, and the economies of scale only really kick in when you're talking about really big farms, and where you're talking about growing products at price parity, and so on and so forth. So I think that there's a difference that needs to be drawn there, a distinction in terms of size of farm and the level of technology that's actually required, and versus obviously human labor.
Absolutely, and I think that's actually a really good segue into our next question, which is around scale. And scale can mean something so different to a large scale commercial warehouse type facility that's retrofitted and has quite high tech and is a little bit more advanced than, say, a small scale commercial facility. But I think when we talk about scale and how to scale successfully, David Flynn, this question is actually for you. In your opinion, how can indoor farming companies, depending on what size you are, plan to scale successfully?
Yeah, well, thank you. Could you put me on the stage? There I am. Thank you. Yeah, so I appreciate that question, and I'm going to frame it in the context of our farm company. So Amplified Ag is my position as a general manager, and Vertical Roots is our farm company that we effectively built technology for over the previous 5 of the last 7 years. And our first farm site that we built for Vertical Roots was 6 containers that yielded 8,000 pounds per month. And over the next 5 years, we built over 200 shipping container farms for Vertical Roots, expanded into 3 sites across 2 states, and we're producing 220,000 pounds per month with a distributed model across 14 states. And so as I kind of reference that backdrop, I'll tell you, we did some things very well, and there's some things we could have done better. And, I could talk about this for an entire hour, and I'll try to keep it brief and just highlight some of the key points to scale. And really, it's more about the preparation of the business and the expertise of the business to put you in a good foundation to be able to scale. But I would say you've got to be good at what you do and keep it simple. The temptation for a lot of CEA growers is to have this wide variety of cultivars that they're growing. And, our experience was that keep it simple, establish a following, a hyper local following, which we did in Charleston, South Carolina. So we became known. We went to farmers markets. We expanded to restaurants. We went to food hubs. We went to retail, and it kind of expanded that way. But we established a reputation, and it was a reputation that was met by consistency and quality week in and week out. And so as I think back, you've got to have a plan, and you have to understand how big it is that you plan to get on that pathway. And in order for you to do that, again, it comes back to delivering quality week in, week out. One of the hesitancies, I think, from the industry in general is just confidence that hydroponic and aeroponic growers can, in fact, produce week in and week out consistency and quality. And we were taken to task by some of our retailers that, it was 2 years before we could get into the DCs. And once you've established that consistency and quality, it gives not only your client confidence, but it gives you confidence as a grower that you actually are ready to scale because you've proven yourself and now you're ready to take the next step. When you get to that next step, timing is critical. So there's always the chicken and the egg discussion, as I like to say, is do you build capacity before you have the sale? Or do you work yourself into a contract and then build that capacity to match that sale? Unfortunately, it's not perfect. Given the lack of contracts in the industry in general. There's sort of a risk that has to be accepted for the business. And then based on your ability to, be good at what you do, you have that gut feel that you can make that move and make that leap. And you've got to understand all the nuances and complexities of the business, especially to the new entrants into the industry, is really setting that good foundation to get there. And then scale incrementally. One of the advantages that we had is by using shipping containers, there's a modularity aspect to that so that we could go incrementally, tack on 4 more containers, tack on another 4. And then as it grew out, we had a site that had 123 containers that we're delivering, but we're able to manage the CapEx spend on that incrementally and make it match the capacity that our clients were offering. And then I would say, keep your customers close. One of the things that perhaps CEA has maybe lost its way, in my opinion, is we always were founded on the hyper-local, fresh, farm to table, right there in the community. And so to the greatest extent possible that folks can, when they scale, is keep the farm very close to the point of consumption or the point of distribution. Because as we've seen, especially in the inflation over the past 2 years in the United States, diesel fuel is very high. Those diesel costs are transferred to the grower in most situations. And so when you're having to go multi-state distribution, that's something that's got to factor into your plan. And then there's the evaluation of profitability, of course, in any business plan. And when you decide to make that leap to go to that next level, there's got to be a profitability analysis on labor, automation, shipping, and all your input costs that are going to be affected by that expansion. And then the last piece I'll talk to a little bit is, as our business, we were farmers and we were also processing. And those are 2 distinct businesses. So when you get to scale and you're making the decision to pack and process your own produce, that is almost a business entity in and of itself, where the farm is its own model on that side. So there are some nuanced decisions that would have to be made with regards to scale. And that's how I look at scale from our experience through our lens.
Thanks, David. I always find Eg's story so insightful because you have managed to take your company to such scale in quite a short period of time, really, as well. And it's been super successful. So I always appreciate hearing from you about that. But one thing you said really stuck with me as well, and it was around your contracts and the chicken and the egg situation that you had brought up. And I think from our perspective, we often see that as a huge barrier for our clients coming into the space before they purchase the technology, even, understanding who their clients are and being able to maintain the contract to offtake that product. So it's something that I think even as an industry, we're just holistically trying to figure that out. But I'm curious if Rob or Jamie have anything to share about that specific component of it, the contracts, the offtake. Is that a huge barrier to scalability for farms in general and for clients in general, in your opinion?
I mean, I think so. Thank you, David. That was incredibly insightful. I didn't feel like a panelist, but I'm just taking notes. And I do agree, right? Consistency is, key. We had clients test us out for weeks and weeks to make sure that we can keep up, and only then would they sign on for something continuous. I think it's important, especially if we are approaching the same, I guess, with David, in a modularity. So we're approaching a new region. It's nice to get offtake before we land, or at least some small anchor clients, and we can ramp up from there. And I think that was incredibly insightful. I do have a question, but I'll get to it afterwards because I know Jamie had a comment as well.
Yeah, I think maybe the experiences in the UK are different than the US, but there are probably some parallels. But I think it fundamentally depends on your model. If you're a grower and you're raising equity into your parent company and deploying that to build farms, you're somewhat doing that at risk if you don't have offtakes. But if you're doing it through a different structure where, for example, we're more on the tech side, we apply the tech into the growers, usually under an SPV structure. A funder comes in, and a funder will always want security. And the longer the security, the lower the risk and the better the price. And if you look at the way that the UK is actually one of the toughest price markets globally in terms of retailers having control over growers. So if you want to go to an infrastructure fund or a VC fund and say, hey, look, here's this great project with this major retailer, give me, 50 million pounds, they're going to want a 5 to 10 year offtake. And traditionally, the way things have worked in retail is, 1 year rolling offtake with a review of pricing, which is something that so there's a misalignment between the investment community and their expectations and actually and what the vertical farming companies need. But again, that's caveated by the model that you pursue. If you're a grower and you've got the cash in the bank, it's at your risk. You're on mute, Erica.
Never fails. That's a really interesting perspective from the UK specific model as well, and that disconnect. Rob, I'm curious to hear your question before we move on.
Yeah, I think I'd be remiss to not mention and give Cultivatd plug, because having worked with you, Erica, and your team, that helped us with farming as a service and really developing our land and expand, our onboarding, really getting community involvement and getting samples and getting offtake before we land. So that's a shout out to the Cultivatd team. I think, David, just being in the US, and it's something that we're exploring now, do you think, without getting any political at all, but the Inflation Reductionary Act, do you think that is going to help with supply chain?
Oh boy, you walked me in there. I think time will. I think time's going to tell with that. I think we're seeing a short-term decrease in fuel prices. At least I see that in South Carolina coming down. I still think that shipping is prohibitively expensive from the West Coast to the East Coast, is driving the number up. But if I could touch on another point on the contract side of things, there's supply is almost infinite with lettuce and leafy greens in America. You'll have your ebbs and flows, you'll have your E. coli's, you'll have your threats to the supply chain, and there'll be events that threaten the supply chain. But at the end of the day, the retailers believe and understand that there will always be lettuce to be had for them to put on the shelves. And so that makes it them less reluctant to sign a contract where they have multiple options on where they're going to select their product from.
Yeah, absolutely. Competition with traditional ag, with greenhouses, as part of CEA as well. But you're right, there is a lot of supply in that area, which I think is why there's now a little bit more diversification into which crops different farmers are looking at. We're seeing a lot more strawberries and things like that, off-season strategies for businesses coming into the market. So I think you're right, David. There's that competition is always going to be there for these products. Hopefully, eventually, we can move in a direction where we can rely more heavily on vertical farming for those types of basic crops and dedicate more agricultural space to the crops we can't grow indoors. But I think that's probably a little bit more of a global strategy we'll have to work on, more so than just what we can accomplish as an industry. But I think that we're kind of headed into this direction. And Rob, the next question is for you, and it's around what pitfalls companies should avoid when allocating capital in this economic climate. David touched a little bit on it earlier when he mentioned, transportation and costs, fuel costs and things like that, where you can reduce a little bit of your economic expenses as a company. But do you have any other thoughts as to what pitfalls companies can avoid?
I keep going back to this, but it's obviously keeping your eye on the ball and mind that the ball is revenue. I think you need revenue to inform and use to build the next level of innovation. I mean, that's my tech brain working, right? Like that's where you build your first version, you sell the first version, you take the proceeds from that to build your next version. I think that's my approach, and I think it translates well, at least in versioning to moderate improvements. And it's really keeping an eye on cash flow. I think your expenditures in compliance and food certification, lead generation, commission structure, delivery requirements. I think a lot of David touched on a lot of these points. Packaging, a lot of these things, they're small in micro, but in macro, they really add up quickly, and that affects your revenue, and it affects your margin most importantly. And then, of course, then you have the technologists come back and then they over-engineer, and that costs money. That could provide opportunity costs and not moving forward. And I realize I say that pretty glibly, but it's complex. And I think our friends here have really pointed out that it's a moving target, right? It's nature, it's the competitive market, it's the market downturns, it's transportation, it's fuel cost, right? So it's keeping really an eye on everything there, and that's hard, and not knowing whether we're going to get the yields, right? Like just the nature of nature. I think that makes the revenue projection forecasts like a moving target and very, very difficult. And that's, I think, why we need ramp up, why we need consistency to better predict these things.
Right, absolutely. And something that came to mind, to flip the question a little bit on its head, if you could advise new companies coming in who are just starting up, maybe they're small scale, if you could advise them where to spend their first, where to really spend it initially, what's worth the investment in from your perspective and your experience so far as a new startup company, what would you advise them?
I mean, again, tech head, I go to build the MVP, and build it terribly, quick and dirty, and get a sale. They say if your first version of your product isn't an embarrassment, then you release too late. And I think if you saw our prototypes, they are an embarrassment, and we're we're going to retire them very soon. But we have an infinite amount of learning from them. They are incredibly important to us for those reasons. And we had hypothesis and they failed. And that's not a failure of the hypothesizer, it's the failure of the hypothesis. And that's learning and that's information. So we can build on that, and we have. So I think really the first piece is building that MVP and making sales. My partner is a sales guy, and we are a sales-driven organization. I'm a technologist. I want to empower that. And then we have our senior mycologist to help us influence the nature to get us better yields. So I think everything we do, we have focused on our revenue, because especially in this market, we just don't want to take any chances.
Absolutely. That's great. Thanks, Rob. And I think that you're 100% right. Fail fast is something I always live by, something a past manager told me a long time ago. And I still, to this day, I'm like, how do I fail fastest at this so we can get to improve faster? So thanks for sharing that. That's really, really helpful. Does anyone want to add anything else to that before we move on? Okay, great. So the next question here is based on the article Cultivatd recently published. We looked at 4 indoor farming companies in particular that closed their doors this past year in 2022. And among these closures, there was a challenging micro and macro climate. We've talked a lot about those factors today, but these included energy prices, interest rates, labor costs, inflation, and these were identified by these companies as their common failures. So the next question is for you, Jamie. In your opinion, what do existing indoor farming companies need to do in order to adapt to these changes in their micro and macro environments? And how can new companies address or prepare for these potential changes?
Tough question, because I think it really depends on their level of exposure to the capital markets and to their investors and how deep they are. So I would expect some of the larger companies, we will see some retraction and redundancies and efficiency savings, if you want to call it that, which is a really horrible way to put it, because people really losing their jobs. I think we will see more of that, and that may be necessary because companies that have raised a lot of capital naturally will overspend. You know, we've done that in the past, and have found that some roles are actually luxuries that maybe we shouldn't have before we generate profit. But I would say that the existing companies, and I know this is a predominantly US focused discussion, I would say not to rely on there being high pricing forever. I know that in the US there's been a tendency to, you know, really hike up pricing for a select basket of goods, and the market's very much been built on that. But I think as we see more and more companies emerging, whether or not they're small urban vertical farms, doing local deliveries, or peri-urban or urban mega farms, there will be market saturation. And when market saturation happens, prices go down naturally because competition increases. So I think there needs to be a preparedness for that, and companies need to start thinking about how they strategize. It's not a really straightforward, easy answer for the existing companies, because it will really be on a case-by-case basis. I'd say for new companies that are entering the sector, some of this has already been conveyed in this discussion in terms of things to look out for, pitfalls and all that kind of stuff. But I think our analysis of the global vertical farming sector has found that about between 95 and 98% of companies in the space are growers that are buying tech, or they may have a little bit of proprietary tech in-house. So I would say start small, especially in this current economic environment, which especially in the UK is going to be, I mean, we're going to see a recession for probably the next couple of years, if not longer, which will obviously impact consumer demand. And then going back to the point around high priced products, that's really not going to fly. So it's thinking about scaling in a very measured way, using your money efficiently. Going back to the previous point was made, who do you hire first and bring on board that's going to really make your company, allocatively and technically efficient. So, I think the other thing is, I find that what we've found, especially looking at other growers here in the UK, and we've just announced today, we're building a farm in Singapore, also building farms in the Middle East. So we're looking at different geographies, but there's shared concerns and challenges in every single one of these sectors. But one thing that we've found is a lot of companies that set up don't really rely enough on the experiences of experienced growers. So there's a very big difference between a plant scientist who can, really, get in there and talk about microbiology and all this, but translating that plant science into a commercial operation are two very, very different things, and that activity needs to happen. And then finally, the kind of third archetype, if we want to call it that, is which our company sits in, is if you want to get involved in the tech space, realize that you're not going to have to raise as much capital as a grower if you want to be a commercial scale grower, but you're going to need to spend at least several years prototyping. Going back to another previous comment, your first prototypes are prototypes, plural, are going to be pretty bad, and you're going to make mistakes, and you really need to find the right talent. So, yeah, I think that's what I've got to say on that.
Yeah, that's a lot to it. There's so much to
Sorry,
it.
I was trying to cover every.
No,
Every
you're right that there's so many varying aspects that go into it. And I think from our perspective, we're often working with clients who are very early stages of building out their plans, right? That's why they come to Cultivatd, to figure out which technology makes the most sense for their idea. But a lot of the time, because it's in that infancy phase, really being prepared for the situations is what I've been pushing lately with our clients. Is you have to stress test yourself to see if what your plan is economically viable, if these things happen, if energy prices increase, or if we do have an economic recession here in Canada, which is looking potentially that may happen in the next year. So stress testing yourself, I think, is a huge component of it. And a lot of the time it's not, turning things around on yourself it's not being negative. You have to plan for those things in order to have a successful business and really open your eyes even to the things that you may not want to see. So I think having that, being super open with yourself and with your own business, and making sure you have the right support and team around you to push through, or to identify all of those factors that may need to make cuts, like Rob said, or you may need to look at your runway, and if it's not there for past a year, how do we reposition ourselves? So having those tough questions and answering them internally is really, really important before you really make that leap, I think, as well. So thanks, Jamie. You covered a lot there. So really, really appreciate that. Super valuable. Our last question before we move into the Q&A, I know we're right on time, but David, this one's for you. Before we move into the audience questions, is what do you believe is the key factor to ensure a company's long-term success?
It's another loaded one, We've been in business for 7 years. I don't know that I would constitute that one as long. Maybe we should bring the Ford Motor Company in, but I will say, just from our experience, it comes back to people. Hire good people who share your passion, your vision, and your culture. If you can have good people on your team, that is the core. And some of the other panelists have mentioned about the right engineers and the right horticulturists. He's absolutely right. Make careful hiring decisions, and then be willing to adapt and pivot as the market directs you to go in that direction, and be attuned to changes in the marketplace. Don't start out with too many products. Keep it simple, and then be able to adapt by making new SKUs. I'll give you an example. We used to grow arugula. Arugula is not profitable in the indoor space because of the weight and the prices you get for arugula. So we created an arugula blend. And then we stayed tight to our customers and wanted to deliver a excellent client experience. And we took their lead, and we started creating other SKUs based on the 6 or 7 leafy greens that we would grow, and we would sell a head product, and then we would market it under a new name. We'd cut the leaves and we'd mix, and we'd cut a butterhead and call it Beautiful Butter, put it in nice packaging. And I guess it really comes back to, again, just hiring good people with your vision, your culture, and then keeping the ideas fresh, being creative, and continuing to innovate as the marketplace demands.
Listen, I couldn't agree more. Thanks, David. That's a really good way to wrap us up, I think, for the actual panel discussion. And we've got some good questions here. So welcome everybody, all of our panelists back onto, there we are, main stage. Thank you all so much for sharing your thoughts on our questions. We do have a couple of questions from the audience here. The first one is an interesting one, actually. It's around the tech manufacturers, if I'm perceiving this right, and the aftercare support that we provide, or that's provided. And they're asking, when will we see a change in the way manufacturers in the CEA space value and support customers after purchase, extended through warranty and ongoing services? So I believe that's more so if a grower is purchasing a vertical farming type of technology, when will we see a shift from the manufacturer's perspective to really more so value the aftercare and support for their clients? I'm going to open up to the floor, whoever wants to start off with that.
Well, I'm happy to take that on just from, my perspective from Amplified Ag is we're a relational type business rather than transactional. And so I don't know if I would necessarily how we see things changing, but of course, warranties are important, and then customer service. Some of our early on sales had some problems, but it's the way that we handle the problem, the way that we put technicians on site, the way that we stay engaged with the client to make sure that they're successful. Because at the end of the day, there's a lot of talk in the industry about making each other successful. And I firmly believe that for this industry to succeed, we need our competitors. Competition's good. We want the other container manufacturers to be successful. We want to share our lessons with other people. We want these businesses that are starting out to learn from companies consultation like Cultivatd. Sorry about the plug there, but Cultivatd and others that can help lend their expertise to some of these growers, because it's only going to better all of us if CEA continues to thrive. And the optimistic viewpoint that Jamie shared, I share that as well. I think there's still a vast opportunity, just given all the challenges we see in the United States with the tyranny of distance, increased prices on shipping and such. And so I think it's very important that customer experience, that we all kind of lean forward and make it a positive experience for all of our clients.
David. Rob or Jamie, did you want to add any final thoughts to that one before we move on to the next question?
I can add a little bit. I didn't quite understand what the kind of baseline assumption for the question was, but I'll just talk a little bit about I don't know if the person who asked the question was having a bad experience with ongoing maintenance or something. But the way we do it is, our challenge is deploying on a global scale, having ready kind of on-hand maintenance teams who understand the system and can support on the hardware side, but then also being able to support centrally on the software side through our team here in London. Vertical farms are long-term infrastructure assets. They're 20, 30, 40, 50 years, depending on what materials you're using. So I think more needs to be done, but I don't think we have enough data points yet, or we don't have the industry is not old enough. This version of the industry is not old enough for us to have really properly learned the lessons. But we've certainly learned, even in the past year, a lot of lessons about how we can support customers, and we've also learned a lot from our customers. I think that's an important thing to say, is to be open to criticism, and also as a tech developer to be able to actually make changes which are reasonable within your system. The good thing about our model is we actually do probably about 80% of our manufacturing, our system in-house. We don't actually rely on third parties, so it's a little bit more integrated. But I do think that the industry has a long way to go in terms of this aftercare.
Thanks so much, Jamie. Appreciate that.
I can add to that. I have a different. We have a very different model at Adapt, and we are oftentimes with the end user in terms of the chefs and retailers, but like with the chefs, we really like to bring a value add. So it's not just the produce. So our farmers are in there, they're face to face, they're on text, and we have invested, in producing social media assets to help activate restaurants, help to activate our retailers' clientele. We have new strains, different strains that people may not know how to cook or how to prepare, what they taste like. And so we actually worked, and I know I stressed having a focus on expenditures, but we have invested in that area, and it's worked out. It's so much more doing that extra little bit, spending some time in those restaurants, developing, like the social media videos, photography, and like gifting it to them. It's not something we charge for. It's just a matter of activating them and promoting them, and it's worked so much more. Always adding value wherever and whenever we can.
Thanks, Rob. I think the marketing perspective is a super interesting one as well. And so I know you guys do so much work with your clients to make sure that they are supported holistically with your product. So it's definitely a client involved model, which I think is really, really important for long-term success for your business model as well. So that's great. We're going to get to the next question here. It's around large-scale commercial indoor farms and the capital expenditure associated with them. And what do we as an industry need to be focusing on in order to improve the ROI and profitability of these large-scale commercial indoor farms? Jamie, did you want to start with that one?
I can take that one, yeah. So I mean, we're just starting to build what I would call the larger scale farms, the kind of 10 to 20 to 30,000 square meter farms on one site, obviously with different growing chambers. I think it's kind of a double-sided coin, or a catch-22, in that usually when you move to a farm for of that size, you end up working with a retailer who has incredibly low pricing. So a lot of the economies of scale that you get from the drop in capex per square meter for the build kind of get evened out with that lower pricing. My view, and again I go back to my opening statement, is I'm an eternal optimist, and I believe that when an infrastructure is up and running, it's up and running, right? You're not going to completely tear down your farm and rebuild it at any point, or even say, I mean, that's going to have a massive impact on the business, on your profitability, on your shareholders, and everything. So moving forward, I think ROI is going to be driven by crop science and advancements. We have a 10 person, 9 PhDs plant science team that continually work on different elements of our systems, and then communicate those findings back to customers through our data network. And that can be anything from crop genetics all the way through to LED wavelengths and crop algorithms. And also innovation can also be looked at by looking backwards as well. So we had an Innovate UK grant, which is a government grant here in the UK, which focused on spinach. Spinach is, as I'm sure most people on this call, is a notoriously difficult crop to grow outdoors and indoors, and is susceptible to a lot of different diseases and has a very, very low price point. But by going back in the seed bank, we found a variety of spinach which was 400 years old, which once we planted it and run through the trials, we almost doubled yields. So I think once these are up and running, we really need to rely on this. Obviously, the farms need to run effectively and so on and so forth, but it's really going to be the crop science that drives the ROI. There will be a ceiling that will be reached for each crop. We're not going to see 5 and 10% increases in yield year on year and year for 20 years. But we're really going to have to rely on the underlying science from the scientific community.
Thanks, Jamie. We just have a quick follow-up to that from an Emma, who asked how you doubled the yield of the spinach. Is that just based on the actual seed variety itself?
It was the seed variety. Yeah, it was 2 things actually. It was the seed variety, and we were also, you'll find it online actually. It was called CHOPS, CHOPS project. I can't remember what the acronym stands for, but it was in media recently. We also combined that with cold plasma seed treatment. So we had increased yields, obviously from that, but most of the increases in yield, and doubling yields for spinach is pretty significant, right? We believe came from variety selection.
Awesome. Thanks for answering that, Jamie. I think, David, I'm not sure if we've lost you. It looks like you're having a few issues. So Rob, I'm just going to ask if you had anything else you wanted to add around profitability and how we improve the ROI of farms as we move into the future of indoor farming.
Oh, wow. How would improve ROI? I think looking at every single instance, I often tell that the story, the infamous story of Henry Ford using the offtakes of his assembly line to create charcoal briquettes, and that's Kingford's coal. He created a whole industry from his waste byproduct. So I think there's opportunity there. There certainly is for us. We have colleagues in the space using their spent grow blocks that we use to create either animal fodder or worm casting, just very high dense nutritional compost for traditional farms. I think that really speaks well to both regenerative farming, but if you can improve your ROI on your very expensive grow block substrate, I think that helps. And I think it really is optimizing your flow, every single optimizing and your processes to get those expenditures down. And I don't mean by robotics, but sometimes I guess that technology fits.
Absolutely. Yeah, it always depends. And I think that's been a big takeaway from this conversation is that it depends there's so many variables that depend on context and the size of your facility, your geography, the political climate where you are. All of those things really do have an impact on ROI, profitability, and long-term success as well. Thank you all so much. We are out of time. I know there was one more, or actually a couple of questions here. Thank you all so much for submitting those. I'll send them out to the panelists via email, get their thoughts, and then we will return those in the chat here. I think everybody should still have access to this after the event ends. And if we do have your emails, I'll send them out to you directly to the people who asked those questions. So thank you so much again for all of the awesome questions that came in. And huge thank you to our panel. Today's been such an interesting conversation. I know I found it super insightful and very, very helpful. So thank you all for being here.